All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
So today is Wednesday, February 18th, and what's been on your mind the past 48 hours? What have you been obsessing over?
Well, nothing in particular. Again, the biggest news story, we don't have a whole lot um, to report on it. Not much in the way of new developments, but of course is the imminent attack on Iran, which is looking increasingly likely. Again, nothing is certain, especially when you're talking about Trump. But we're putting all the pieces in place. There are constant reports, a steady stream of reports of air assets, for example, being moved into the region. Meanwhile, the USS Gerald R. Ford continues to steam towards the Arabian Sea and is due to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, I believe, sometime tomorrow. So it's well on its way. And then there was a report that came out, I think it was in Reuters the other day, and then again in Axios today, that the U.S. is anticipating a weeks-long war, something anyway that really looks like a war. And Axios is saying that it's imminent. It's going to happen in the next couple of weeks or very few weeks.
How do they expect to keep it?
90% chances. That's how they calculated.
But how do they expect to contain it to a week? Why would they see a weeks-long war?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't really know exactly, I am just dependent on other experts, but most people seem to think that they have maybe enough missiles on their ships and maybe enough aircraft to actually conduct a pretty intensive campaign for at least 2 weeks or up to 2 weeks. But then there would have to be some sort of lull. Now, maybe they've worked something out. I don't know. I guess it looks like actually they understand that Iran is a real risk and Iran can hit back. And that's why they're putting so many assets into the region. And I expect the hope is that they're going to try to knock them out, quickly with that first blow, or do significant damage to their air defense capabilities and their offensive missile capabilities. So I think, again, what happens in the first couple of days is going to be extremely important. Will they succeed in doing that, or will Iran this time have the intelligence, maybe because of radars and other equipment supplied by China and Russia, to respond immediately, even not just wait to take the blow, but to send their own missiles flying when they see the incoming aircraft. Oh, again, I think it may be those first 2 days are going to be critical, to the outcome of this war.
But it just seems impossible. We've talked about this before. Iran is 3 times the size of Ukraine. We have seen Russia pummel Ukraine for years now, and somehow Ukraine is still standing. So it's just, how do they expect to be able to knock them out in 48 hours a week? It's just, surely there are people, these are professional military men, right?
Right. Now, there are some ways the comparison with Ukraine is valid to a great extent. And in fact, you could even argue that, what do we say is not 3 times, but even 4 times the size of Ukraine, because if we look at it, Russian-occupied Ukraine versus Ukrainian-occupied Ukraine, those are I think the territories that really matter. And all of Russia versus, Ukrainian-controlled Ukraine. And what 3 times the population, really. So, that's an important comparison. But there are some differences that I think we have to keep in mind. And that is that, okay, this is a ground war, and the Ukrainians are still on the ground. But if we're just talking about an air war, well, the Russians did manage to pretty much wipe out the Ukraine's offensive air capabilities in the first few days. They destroyed much of their air force, and then they sank their fleet. And then but of course, Ukraine still had this ground army. It still had extensive air defense, but it had a complete, legacy system that had been left by the Soviet Union that was really very effective and was nationwide. And it took a long time for the Russians to degrade that and eventually to destroy that. It took, well over a year. Iran doesn't have that kind of air defense. Again, maybe, I don't know, a lot of it comes down to how well protected their missiles are. How can they survive, a massive and sustained air attack by the U.S.? I think they probably can, again, but we're just, we're relying on these reports. We know that they've been preparing. They understand what the U.S. has. They've created these underground cities. And so I think that they're going to be able to survive it, and they will be able to continue to fight this air war. So, yeah, again, the U.S. can do a great deal of damage no matter what. They can kill people. They can destroy a lot of equipment and so forth. But if you're going to measure the success of a war effort, you have to look at the objective. And the objective clearly here is regime change here, regardless of what they say. Again, the nuclear stuff is just is a red herring. That's not something that's supposed to be gone, according to Trump, and now he's going to blow up the dust. Okay, this is all very silly. It's about regime change. I think we all know that. And if at the end of the day, when the dust settles, okay, the Iranian government is still there, and they have inflicted some significant damage, on the Americans and on the Israelis, you'd have to say victory goes, it's a painful victory, but a victory to the Iranians.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you could say that that the U.S. military could say that it would just be a week or a couple weeks campaign, because sure, you can maybe pack up your boats and steam them back and say that's a victory, but you have military bases, these permanent installations that are there. And even, let's say you were able to wipe out all of their ballistic missiles, which I think is impossible. But even if you did, there's still, the militias in Iraq and throughout the region, as well as these drones that they could use to just pummel these bases. They can't just say, oh, it's over. We hit you really hard with all we got. Now don't do anything back. We're in their territory. We're in their backyard. They will kick us out, and they will keep on hitting Israel too, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Again, it's actually, it's going to be more than a couple of weeks. I think we would need to, or some of the ships would have to go back to Diego Garcia, for example, after 2 weeks to reload. But Reuters, again, was talking about a week's long, probably more than 2 weeks. It's 3-4 weeks. Who knows what that may turn out to be optimistic. We don't know. Yeah, and then also you think about the Houthis. The Houthis were firing missiles up until the end, and that was when, reason that the ceasefire, we declared victory and went home, right? That's what Trump did. And again, the Houthis have a lot less than the Iranians, and they're shooting from a much smaller territory. Yet, and we definitely were trying to degrade their missile capabilities, but we failed. So, if that is any sort of let's say a test case, an indicator of what's to come, and I think it certainly should be, it just doesn't look good. But clearly they're going to try it. They're going to attempt it. And, maybe they have some trick up their sleeves. We have to admit in the past we've been surprised by things they've done. They are creative people in these defense departments, and especially within the intelligence communities. But it just doesn't look very good. We'll just say that, for the U.S. military as far as actually attaining their objective. It just seems very, very unlikely.
Yeah, I go back and forth about whether or not it's possible that we can get some type of negotiated settlement, because I think Trump and many people in the Pentagon understand how dangerous this is, how suicidal this is, and they want an off-ramp. And, and clearly Iran doesn't want this either. Iran and the United States, this huge conflict that's looming, neither one of these parties wants to do it. And so it just feels like, well, then surely we can avoid this absolute catastrophe that we're just marching into. But even Reuters, you say, or Axios saying 90%. I mean,
Yeah.
is
Well,
there
who
any
knows?
chance?
Well, there's a possibility, for example, that 90%. Okay, let's look at it from a different vantage point. Maybe Trump really has no intention of doing this. Maybe he really understands how disastrous this would be. And this is exactly the sort of thing that he wants to avoid. It's what he criticized George W. Bush for Operation Iraqi Freedom. He said it was a disaster. And I think he really understood that, or understands that it was. So let's say that Trump really understands that this could be a disaster, something that could really sink his presidency. So in that case, what's going on? Well, Trump always uses mafia tactics to negotiate, right? And maybe that's all this is. Okay. So for, let's say, even the 90% that figure that appeared in the Axios report, perhaps that was leaked purposely just to put pressure on the Iranians. That's not impossible. Again, there's all kinds of things going on behind the scenes. And you hear that the negotiations apparently are going ahead, and they're talking about real things, about how to control the uranium, the enriched uranium, actually maybe having it stored in Russia at a certain point in its cycle, that kind of thing. So there's always a chance. It's not impossible. There's always a chance that a deal can be reached. And we know that it can be, because one was reached in the past. And they could do it again. It's something the Iranians have always said, yeah, we're willing to deal on this. In a way, they would have a point if they said, no, why is it that we have to do this? Nobody else is subject to these really strict, inspections, this really strict, regime, uranium enrichment regime. Why is it only us? And say, forget it. But they have shown a willingness over the years. Yeah, we will deal on this, okay, so that you don't have an excuse to attack us. We do have a right to enrichment, but if you are truly afraid that we're going to create nuclear weapons, we will allow you to have very intrusive inspections and have other means of, safeguarding the process, preventing denying us a breakout capability. They're willing to do that. They did in the past. They did it again. A previous administration agreed to it. So it could happen, right? It could happen. And maybe there will be some sort of twist. And that difference will be what Trump says, okay, see, this is why, my deal is so much better than Obama's. His was the worst deal in history. Mine is the best deal ever in history. This is great. And now that the ships can go home, that was part of my very, very, art of the deal, my negotiating tactics here. We put on the pressure and they caved in. Maybe they didn't really cave in, but he'll claim that, and then he could declare victory. Let's hope. If he does that, more power to him. But again, it's just that you assemble all this force and you have these very, let's be honest, very incompetent negotiators, real estate moguls who don't know anything about any of this. But maybe you can get enough experts in under them, and actually get a real deal hammered out. And meanwhile, and Trump can somehow just plug his ears and stop listening to the Tom Cottons and Lindsey Grahams and Netanyahu's, who are constantly pushing to him, suggesting that if he does, he actually does make a deal, then he will have given a victory to the Iranians and he'll proven that he's not a real man or something, that he'll just won't listen to all of that and will go ahead. I don't think the odds of that are very good, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, you think, you're just so clear that Iran is willing to play ball. But the big question, it just comes like with this negotiating team, we have Witkoff and Kushner. Is this more of Netanyahu's negotiating team than it is Trump's? Because I think we know their allegiance. They are ultra Zionists, especially Kushner, and Witkoff is as well.
Yeah.
But I think Kushner,
Witkoff
extreme.
is really too.
Yeah, but Witkoff is extreme, and so that's what's just kind of scary. Is like, okay, this is our negotiating team, or this is Israel's negotiating team more than the United States. It feels like,
right.
And we know that Israel doesn't. This is what I would have more hope for the negotiations if we had a more impartial negotiator that wasn't, Israel's negotiator. Because once you start talking to the other side, it just becomes so clear to you that, hey, these guys are willing to play ball. I heard, like you said, to have a third party store their uranium so they don't even hold on to the enriched uranium. And they would delay, they would put a pause to all enrichment for the next 3 years. Like they're really was saying like, look, we don't want a nuclear weapon. We had the most intrusive inspections. There are cameras in all of our nuclear facilities. We're subject to 8 times more IAEA inspections than any other country that has a civilian nuclear program. And we're now even saying that we won't even hold on to our enriched uranium. It will be stored in another country where it can be inspected as well. And we won't even enrich. Like clearly we're doing everything.
Yeah. I think they will still enrich, but they are giving up partial control of it.
Right. I heard that maybe they would pause it for 3 years. Who knows exactly? But. Right. So, but
because I think they have more than they need at this point. They have that 60% uranium, and they can dilute that and use that, over the next 3 years or so. I think that's probably what's behind that.
Right. So, I mean, it was so clear that Iran is wanting to play ball and wants to, and I think that's why. Netanyahu is always afraid of negotiations because it starts to humanize, and the other negotiating team's like, hey, we're really. These guys aren't threatening us. They're real people. They want to play ball. We don't want this war. They don't want this war. But if you have Kushner and Witkoff as the representatives, then it changes. It's because, oh no, they're adopting the Israeli position. And that's
they also. I guess you have to say that they also, both of them, have loyalties to Trump. They are Zionists, like Trump. He's a Zionist, quite clearly. But one is his son-in-law, and the other is his friend, and they do have loyalties, one to his father-in-law, one to his friend. So if Trump really puts down his foot and maintains a consistent position, negotiate, he could make it happen. I believe he could, even with these guys, as long as we have sufficient expertise underneath them, because there are a lot of technical details that need to be hammered out. But it just takes one mistake. It's just like one moment of weakness for the war to begin. In other words, it's like, okay, he's constantly being pressured all, through the media and by associates and so on and so forth. And then, and they're always working on him, suggesting that, okay, well, actually we've worked out this plan. It looks like it's really good. It could succeed, high chance of success in 3 days or something, which may be, a bunch of BS, probably would be, but of course it would be. But he's finally sold on this is my way out. I'll take this, this plan. And then we go over the precipice.
Yeah. I mean, there was that FBI document that was released in the Epstein files that said that Trump is compromised by Israel and Jared Kushner is the real brains behind his presidency. I mean, this is just what was released in that FBI doc. Who knows how true it is, but it seems to fit. And if that's the case, it's the only explanation that I have for why this might happen, because I just every night before going to bed, and when I wake up, I'm like, surely we won't do this. They understand, right? The possibility of an aircraft carrier getting sunk. I mean, even if it doesn't get sunk, just if it gets hit, then that thing's out of commission for years. It's so dangerous, and all these bases out there in the Middle East in this hostile territory, it doesn't make sense. And
it doesn't make sense. And that report may very well be true, that he may be compromised. They may have compromat on him, and they're using that to push him into this war. That's certainly possible. I don't deny it. But I think it's still believable that he would do it without that. I mean, there's all kinds of pressure on him aside from that.
But that pressure is the same thing. In a sense, it's compromised. I've been thinking about this. Like, how is it seems too fantastical that a foreign country could have so much influence in our own country that's able to just hold so much power within the United States. But then I was just thinking, it's kind of what you were telling me earlier, like, when we talk about the Ukraine war, and I wonder, like, people are getting force conscripted and are upset and want to fight back. And you say, well, it really just matters if you have a small organized group that they can control the majority, even if they're the 1% or whatever. If they're organized and coordinated, then they can. And then I was just thinking about, with Israel, it's like they've been in their mindset, they're in a constant state of war. They're a hyper militarized country. They believe in this, they're in this hostile environment, and they believe in this greater Israel project. And when you're at war, you'll do whatever it takes to try to win. Like, this is our goal. We need to create greater Israel. We need to establish our security, whatever, from just thinking about it from the Israeli point of view. And then, well, how do we do that? Well, the military is a hyper organized machine. And then I think about how they controlled the United States and how they got so much power in the United States. It's almost like a military operation. They're understanding it like, okay, they got the board. We need to hold all these positions of power, because the only way that we can create greater Israel and create our security in our Jewish state, our homeland, is through the United States. So it is a military mission for us to try to occupy all these positions within the United States, to have this dual loyalty, but the ultimate loyalty is obviously to the Zionist project. And that's what they've done over so many years. And then it just kind of makes sense. It's like, and most of us are oblivious because we don't even think about it. Like, there's a military operation, that some other country is thinking about how do they control our halls of power, use money to influence for their own personal. I mean, a lot of time I think people think about it as just like, how do they personally enrich themselves? But I think it makes a lot more sense when we think of, when we think about lobby groups. It's like, how did that corporation get wealthier and write out its own carve outs for itself? But here it's like, no, this is military. This is like existential for them. Do you think that's the right way to look at it?
Yeah. Well, obviously this is, these people are passionately attached to the concept of greater Israel. And, they understand again that greater Israel, is not possible without U.S. support. It's just that simple as something. So for decades, if it wasn't for U.S. support, that really became pretty much unconditional, or, not entirely. It's actually become sort of more unconditional over time, but really solidified during, under Johnson, especially. I think I always point to the turning point of the USS Liberty. I think that's a good, if you want to, point to the beginning of kind of Zionist domination of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. That's the incident that you should point to. So yeah, they have that understanding. They have that passionate attachment. They have the resources, and they are helped also by, let's say, by organic, in domestic support, from the Christian Zionists. That's part of it too. That helps them. I don't think it's the main or really the driving factor, but that helps them. And so they have achieved this outsized influence.
How organic do you think that is? The Christians?
I think actually, I used to assume that it was totally it was pretty much a creation of the Jewish Zionists. But after reading a very detailed history of Christian Zionism, I changed my mind. It actually is something that began pretty much began at the same time that Jewish Zionism began, under Theodor Herzl, which was secular in its initial foreign incarnation. It began pretty much, but maybe even a little earlier. I think you can say it began a couple of years earlier. And it's something that did develop really on its own terms and went along parallel tracks. I think now that increasingly it is sort of driven and shaped by, let's say, Israeli or Jewish Zionism. But it does have its own roots. I think that's clear. That's something, and it's something that has, again, strengthened the Zionist cause within this country. So anyway.
It's hard for me to believe that it just has its own roots, that there wasn't something, you know what I mean? It's just such a weird thing that would just pop up. And why would it just pop up around the same time? Jewish Zionism?
But again, it actually antedated, and you can't really find any connection between the Christian Zionists and Theodor Herzl and his movement. Again, Theodor Herzl was very secular, and they were actually, I remember reading stories of some of the Christian Zionists approaching like synagogues and telling them, yeah, we support this, you return to Israel. And the response that they usually got is that you're nuts. We're not doing that. That's not part of what we believe or whatever. This was, it was their own thinking. It is, look, there are all kinds of, in the 19th century, there are all kinds of really, what I consider to be very strange, we call them heretical movements, real corruptions of traditional Christianity. Were born during that century. And one of them was Christian Zionism.
What were some of the others? Or you don't
Well,
want
I
to
would say, like, yeah,
we don't want to criticize people. I think I know what you're talking about.
We're a geopolitical show. I don't want to go, offend anybody. But anyway, let's just leave it at that.
Okay. What were we just talking about before we went off this tangent?
Yeah, well, you were just saying that say this is sort of like a militarized, you have to have, for a movement to be successful, it needs to be organized and it has to have elite connections. It's, people make the mistake of thinking, well, we see an opinion poll, 80% of the people think this way. That's the way we're going to go. Not necessarily. If there is 2% that's very, very well organized, has the money, has the resources, has developed all the connections with the elite, has people among the elite, they can have their way. That 2% can rather than the 80%. And that's actually just well known within political science. That's how things work. And you'd have to say that the Zionists have understood that and had great success with that over the decades.
Yeah, I think what they underestimated is just the unwillingness of the U.S. to go along with it. In the light of this genocide and now this impending war with Iran, people are starting to question and look deeper, and they are recognizing the source of where this is coming from, and they are maybe coming to, kind of an conclusion that I just came to. Is like, wait, maybe this is an intentional kind of military occupation of the halls of power. In a sense, maybe not necessarily militaristic or whatever, but people are seeing it in that sense that there is something wrong here. There's a very unhealthy relationship, and there's so many different avenues that you could have gotten down there. Just if you're on social media, you start to see things and start to question things, like whether it's the Charlie Kirk or Epstein or this conflict with Iran or Gaza. There's enough. Everybody, unless you're living under a rock or you just sit and watch Fox News all day, everybody has something that this image of Israel is severely tainted here in the United States now, at least for people under the age of 50, I think.
Yeah. Well, again, no, it's certainly true. And we've talked about that a lot. There has been a real sea change, a really dramatic shift in opinion. And that's ringing the alarm bells in Israel. And it may be part of, I don't know, which is part of what is pushing Netanyahu and his government to take this, reckless step of attacking Iran. Because again, they want the U.S. to lead the way, but they know that they are a very likely target if that happens, and they can really suffer damage. But they maybe see that there's a window of opportunity that is closing. It's not okay. First of all, there's a military window. Just the hard power of Iran is going to increase significantly over the next few years in terms of both their missile capabilities. They will, again, according to Theodore Postel, sometime, I think he actually said 5 years, but I think that's really kind of like I would say the outer limit. With especially Russian help, they could do it quicker. They'll have the capability to just wipe out Tel Aviv just with conventional weapons, really just take out Tel Aviv. And they will have eventually a very solid air defense system, the kind that we see being used to great effect in Russia. Again, there was that attack with the 94 drones against Putin's Valdai residence. Not one of them made it there. And that's not unusual. I mean, the Russians have very, very good air defense. Occasionally something gets through, and we always hear about it. But that's, 1 out of 100 or depending on what you're talking about, drones, or 1 out of 20 or something. It's a small fraction that gets through. They have excellent air defense. And if Iran has air defense like that, then it's just over for Israel and the U.S. Now, they say they their military planners may understand that this is very risky. This is not going to be easy. That's why they're talking about a weeks-long war. But maybe some of them, enough of them, believe that it can be done, and if it's done now. But a year from now, 2 years from now, it's just not going to be possible. So they're looking at that. There's again, the hard military aspect of it, but then there's also, there are upcoming midterms, and there's a chance that we'll see a significant change in the makeup of the Congress. That now we have just a few outliers that dare to be critical in a meaningful way of Israel and its actions. That might increase significantly. Trump will lose, his majority, the Republican majority in Congress, and his freedom of action just may be greatly reduced. They feel like with Trump, this is some guy that we've talked about how he's reluctant to go into war, but at the same time, he's a Zionist, and they feel like they can push him into a war. We'll see. Hopefully they're wrong in that assessment, but it looks like they believe they can do it, and this is their time to do it.
Yeah. Something that just really just kind of pissed me off a bit is when I heard that Israel asked Iran and said, like, look, this is the U.S. attacking you, so you don't touch us, right? It's just like, man, you get us to do this war. You just want to stay out of it completely. It was the same thing after 9/11 as well. It's just like they just, they don't want to get their hands dirty. Thank goodness Iran said, no, we know who's behind this. We're coming after you if the U.S. attacks as well. Right. It's just, the whole thing is just so insane for Israel. This idea of creating greater Israel and all this, it's like, there's not enough Jews in the world to occupy greater Israel, even if you did somehow were able to achieve all that landmass. It's like, you guys, Israel could have, if they didn't, do this genocide and just go insane the past couple of years, they could have gone away with it. They had the greatest thing. Their propaganda was effective. They had all the halls of power. They just got all this money flowing in here. They got universal health care, free education. You had your paradise. You did it. You pulled it off. Congrats. Whatever. You fooled all of us. And now look what they've done. They've just gone forward, and now everybody is just so pissed. Everyone's so pissed here around the world, and for very good reason. It's just like, you guys messed up. You could have gotten away with this. Maybe if you kept the same strategy, just build a couple settlements, just kill a couple people a month or whatever it is, like the way that you've been doing it. Still horrible, but it's enough that it doesn't raise this international outcry. Right. We're not seeing babies getting blown up in 4K on our phones. And, I just can't believe, what they've done. And just the hubris, that like, you guys had it made, and it's too greedy.
Yeah, no, they overplayed their hand. I think that's no question about it. I mean, it's just two completely different worlds, pre-October 7th and post-October 7th, as far as Zionism goes. I mean, that's right. More importantly, the perception of Zionism.
It's just that confidence that they had, that they were, because it's like that video that we saw from Netanyahu just saying, like, the U.S., it's easy to bend to your will, like, it's crazy how much, they worship us, basically. And there's that they just felt like that was an immutable fact, that the United States will always back them, that we will worship the ground they walk on no matter what. As America's, they worship the Jews, they worship Israel, like, that's kind of what they felt. And now they're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I think they still have a lot of that hubris, but there is, but at the same time, there is a growing sense of alarm or anxiety. I think they're still confident they'll be able to, like Netanyahu, he's the Houdini artist. He always seems to get out of difficult situations. There are many times the end of his career has been predicted, and he always manages to survive and then you could say the same thing of Israel. I think that they have that same sense, we'll get out of this somehow. But they do understand that there are new challenges, and that's why Netanyahu talked about the Eighth Front. He realized he really needed to allocate more resources to fighting that information war within the U.S. because they had suffered some real losses, even as they made some so-called gains in places like Lebanon and Syria.
Have we been seeing an exodus of Israelis out of Israel recently? You know, with this war coming. I mean, it seems
I haven't heard about that. You know, I've been reading Haaretz, and that's it. Maybe it's happening, but it's not being reported.
I also find that odd, don't you? That if you would at least see some more people that, you know, you have families, you're living there, and you saw what happened in Tel Aviv 7 months ago when Iran struck. So hypersonic missiles hitting in downtown Tel Aviv, getting pummeled. And just like you're saying, you know, Ted Postal saying that they could just wipe out Tel Aviv with their conventional weapons.
Right. Well, not right now, but in the not so distant future, if they improve the accuracy of their long range ballistic missiles. Right.
We saw them strike Tel Aviv. I think that we know that they can do some serious damage.
Sure.
Right. So I just like if you're an Israeli, I just feel like you know you have access to the internet. You should be concerned about your own self-preservation and well-being to some extent. I just imagine there has to be a lot of people that are worried, and if they're not, then this is also worrying because it shows you that the people that remain in Israel, where they are, just psychologically, that they feel like this is something that they're going to go the distance on this as well, and their willingness to use a nuclear weapon if they have to. There has to have some confidence insurance policy that no, we're going to do this. We're going to, it's just insane to me. I just don't get it.
Yeah. Well, there's, I've been struck. I know I've mentioned this before, but just the the absence of any kind of criticism, on the left in Israel. And the left is pretty small to begin with. Well, not to begin with, but now it used to be a much greater force decades ago. It's a very, we're talking about 8% of the population, I believe, that identifies as left now in Israel. But even within that left, they in general just defer to the IDF. A lot of them, even with regard to Gaza, I mean, there's maybe only half of that 8% that are really critical of the IDF and what it did in Gaza. So we're talking about 4% of the total population. And when it comes to things like Iran, even that, you don't even have that 4%. It's just sort of like they simply trust their leaders, the IDF, and even Netanyahu to do the right thing for Israel. And they just don't. They can't fathom actually criticizing him on that point. They just have completely ceded those larger security issues, vis-a-vis Iran and Lebanon and Syria, to the IDF and to the ruling administration.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then they're digging their own grave. It's just, and the graves of so many others. This. I just can't.
Oh, yeah, no, I really hope it doesn't happen. I mean, it's just, I'm sometimes I just get sick to my stomach when I think about it. It's going to be bad for everybody concerned. I really do hope it does not happen.
Yeah. And just once the war can spread like wildfire, it just, once it happens, we don't know where it can go. If the Chinese get involved, if, Russia gets more heavily involved, and we're just seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that's likely, but it could turn into an all-out regional war. Iraq, for example, especially could go up in flames, because there's a lot of, the current government is pretty much under the thumb of the U.S., and that's not popular with the people. Recently in an election, it was a very strong pro-Iranian group actually won. And Trump was very angry about that. But that shows you, kind of the feelings within Iran. And we have bases there that are not welcome. And if the Iranians attack them, there may also be attacks from the ground. We'll see. And it could turn into something, again, more than just an exchange of missiles between Iran on the one side and the U.S. and Israel on the other side. It could become a true regional war.
Yeah. And we talk about the Strait of Hormuz and just all these Western countries, they're in a very precarious position. They're very weak. They're very unpopular, very restless populations that want change. I have a feeling that this war is just going to set off a chain reaction throughout the Western countries as well, that people are just going to be, we've had it,
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, maybe, it's hard to say. Those sort of things are very hard to predict.
Yeah. Okay, well, should we move over to Ukraine a little bit? Do we want to even talk about the negotiations there? We were talking about negotiations in Iran.
Actually, honestly, I don't think it's worth talking about. I think that's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And you can go to other people and get very good analysis of what's going on there. But in the end, if you listen to the analysis carefully from the well-informed people, is that it's a waste of time. It's not really going anywhere. But we can talk some briefly about what's happening on the front lines. There's, I guess you'd have to say, two major developments in the last couple of weeks. One was the shutoff of Starlink, which we've talked about. And some Russian units were actually using Starlink. So they, when it was suddenly shut off, they did actually suffer some problems. But it's not, there was some sort of attempt, I think, within especially the Ukrainian information space, but also in the Russian information space. It's kind of funny, but you have, especially recently, it seems like you have almost a meeting of minds, or an equal number of, let's say, people who believe, let's say, in Ukrainian propaganda on the Ukrainian side is on the Russian side, and vice versa. Like with the Starlink question, you have a lot of Ukrainians crowing about the success of Starlink, of the shutoff, and then you get a number of people on the Russian bloggers saying the same thing. But then you get a number of Ukrainians, especially military ones. I think they're ones who know. There are people, information warriors, and then there are people who are actually in the military and have a better sense of what's going on. And they say, yeah, it created some problems for them, but it's not going to, in the end, it's not going to make any difference, and they're going to overcome them. And they weren't entirely reliant on it, not by a long shot. So you see that with Starlink. And then there is also the counterattacks. But let me say, before I get into the counterattacks, the Russians already are doing things to remedy that situation, the loss of Starlink. They have sent up these, essentially what are weather balloons. They go up into the stratosphere, and they carry just a communication platform that acts like a satellite, though it's not a true satellite. It's, it's not in Earth's orbits in the stratosphere, but it can stay up there for several days and function as a platform and actually work as a replacement. And, you send up a succession of them. And then they also have, I guess there are satellites being developed, or they may be beyond the development stage, and will soon be launched over the next couple of years, that will replace, the idea is to replace the Starlink satellites so that they'll have their own analogous system.
So they basically, the Russians kind of just hijacked the Starlink system?
Yeah. Well, apparently some units would use it. Others didn't use it at all, is what I understand. The figure that I hear most often is maybe like 10% of communications actually made use of Starlink.
How did they use it? How did they get the terminals? Did they make their own, or did they steal them from?
Apparently it's not too hard to get a hold of them. Just
buy it on Amazon.
Maybe. Get
it delivered.
And then there's some talk about, that they are still using Starlink to some extent. There are people who cooperate in Ukraine who will buy a Starlink, and because they have a Ukrainian address and everything, it's all legitimate. And it's not shut down by Elon Musk, but then somehow that gets to the Russians. I don't know about that, but they understand they got to replace it. I think they probably always knew that this day was coming, and so it was only a limited number of units that were using it. And also there was a certain number of drones that were taking advantage of it, that were plugging into the Starlink system, long-range drones. But the thing is, when it comes to drones, the Russians have a lot of options. That was, just one of the many arrows they had in their quiver, and they have many other arrows, including for long range. One thing that they do, is, the Ukrainians have noticed this recently. They'll have a mothership, that's carrying, let's say, 4 smaller drones. And the mothership will fly fairly deep into Ukrainian territory, and then the little drones will launch from the mothership, and their batteries are fully charged, so they can go quite a distance from that point. And that in that way they achieve, their long range objectives. And that's just one example. There's a constant, a very rapid evolution of drone capabilities on both sides. But again, I think everybody agrees that the Russians have taken the lead here. That's Starlink. That's something on the drones. And then speaking of the drones, I think we should mention a war game that was played in Lithuania recently. It was, they had the Ukrainians play the Russian side, and then they had NATO officers on the other side, representing NATO. And what, according to the report, that came out of this Lithuanian war game, is that there was a unit of a UAV unit, which is to say a drone unit. I think only 10 drone operators, Ukrainians, who were there to represent the Russians. And they actually had less capability than what a real Russian unit would have. But, still, these are expert drone operators. And apparently these 10 guys completely wiped out 2 mechanized battalions of NATO. And they told you guys, you wouldn't last a day against the Russians. We could see you out there standing, in front of your APC or just walking nonchalantly down the road or whatever. You're thinking because you're 10 kilometers in the rear that you're safe. That's not the way it works in this war. You guys, you got to change everything. Your training is completely useless for the war that you would have to fight against the Russians. So anyway, I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I think this NATO equipment has actually been kind of damaging to Ukraine, and in many ways, because I feel like there's a lot of pressure to use this equipment. There's so much NATO. I heard, even Australia sent tanks, and that they're there, and so it's like, well, we got to use them, and then that's why we saw the most horrific summer offensive imaginable in 2023, right? I mean,
Right.
it's just like they just felt like they had to use all this stuff, and it's just like, this
Right.
isn't the war we're fighting. It's not World War II. We're not doing blitzkriegs. This is insane. But that's the problem.
Right.
We're stuck with our systems that are outdated, and we're trying to just, square the circle. We're just trying to just jam it in there and just be like, it's gonna work, and it's not. It's like it's a hindrance. It's almost like it'd be better if we just started clean.
Yeah. No, it's a problem. Exactly. Sometimes
it's the same
when
in Iran, in the Persian Gulf, with all these
Right.
boats that we're sending there. It's the exact same thing. It's like, why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah. Well, you can see that in many areas of technological and economic development. I remember when we were in Taiwan several years ago, you commented on the fact how Taiwan actually seemed kind of more backwards than mainland China, than Shanghai did. And it's partly because, well, it did develop Taiwan did very rapidly during the 1960s and 1970s. And there was a lot of construction and, the infrastructure was laid then. But now that's aging infrastructure and it's noticeable, but the Chinese started from essentially zero, and they've built up a whole new infrastructure, and you can see the difference. And then another thing is like with phone systems that, the U.S.'s cellular system is a mess. And anybody who lives here knows that it is. It's just not there are a lot of gaps, there are different carriers, and it's just it's kind of a, well, it's a mess. We'll just leave it at that.
And expensive.
And expensive. That's right. And very, very expensive compared to other countries, and just about every other country in the world. And then there's some third world countries that didn't have any kind of landline system, and they just went straight into the, cellular system, and they have good, cheap cellular systems, better than the U.S. does. So, yeah, I think you can apply the same thing to the military. We built up this very, very powerful military, and with that came certain ways of thought and, in different institutions, and they're all very comfortable doing things the old way. And now this new revolution has come along of, hypersonic missiles and drones and so forth. And it means to really address it, you got to tear down the whole structure that you had before and build it up again. And there's always a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah. It's when we talk about these conflicts, like in Ukraine, something that I've noticed, and the United States, even what we've seen, the exchange between Iran and Israel and the United States, is that, do we really have ballistic missiles? I know we have some, but I just haven't seen them used, where we see that, Iran using them to great effect. We've seen, even in, with Russians, they have the Rushnik that we've seen used a few times, but it doesn't seem like the U.S. we surely have that technology, right? I mean, a ballistic missile. The basic ones aren't that. It's just a trajectory, right? I mean, that's what makes it a ballistic missile. So,
Right.
do we not have them? Why do we not develop that capability? Did we just put all of our eggs into the Air Force and like that's your crown jewel?
You know, we do. I mean, well, the ATACMS are ballistic missiles. The HIMARS, those are they're even more primitive, so we call them rockets, but they're ballistic as well. But we don't really have very advanced ballistic missiles. You know, anything that's like I think that's comparable to the Iskander-M, for example, that the Russians have.
Did the Houthis have more advanced ballistic missiles than the United States?
It's kind of hard to say that, but maybe they do. Maybe they do. We seem to be when we talk about our offensive capabilities, short of nuclear, conventional offensive capabilities, it's generally Tomahawks, right? That's what was used actually in Operation Midnight Hammer, and we're talking about supplying it to Ukraine. That seems to be the top of our line is the Tomahawks. But those are actually old missiles. They're cruise missiles. They're not ballistic missiles.
Very slow, very easily detectable, developed in the 1980s.
Right. They have their strengths. I guess they just by flying close to the ground, they can evade a lot of radar, and I think they can carry a fairly large warhead. So it's not like they're a joke or anything, but in spite of the updates, the fact is that they are an 80s weapon. And it just seems like we haven't gone along. We didn't have that revolution in missile technology that other countries have gone through.
What's the military budget of Yemen's Mila?
I think it's probably a lot less than 1.5 trillion. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, but it just goes to show, when we think about it like that, it's just like, what are we doing here? What have we been spending our money on? Just how corrupt the system is, and just this, and that bill, that number is where most of the justification of U.S. might comes from. We just look at the graph, see how much we spend, boys. Look at that, we're pretty good. Yeah. It's like, but the Houthis have better missiles than us.
More than 6 times of the next largest military budgets in the world.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I said that incorrectly. I'm sorry. More than the next 6th largest.
I thought it was more than the next
military
10.
Budgets combined.
I think it's the next 10.
Yeah, it may be changing. That's what I heard. Sometimes I see 10. Sometimes just the other day I saw 6.
I don't know if we actually increased the budget by 50%. They were saying that. If that's the case, then we're probably at more than every country combined. At some point.
Right. Well, that hasn't happened yet. It is. I think it's roughly $1 trillion now. When you look at really, it's not just the defense budget, but it's also because a lot of, let's say, Homeland Security and the Department of Energy, a lot of that is actually dedicated to the military. And if you look at the military aspects of those budgets as well, you add it all up, it ends up being about $1 trillion. And then Trump wants to raise all of that by 50%. Or maybe just for the Pentagon, so it would go beyond 1.5 trillion.
I think there's a problem once we start using trillions, then it just becomes make-believe money. It's no longer, we can't even fathom what that is. Like, it's hard to wrap your mind even around $1 billion, but then when you get to $1 trillion, it's like, it's just make-believe now.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's all. It's a whole bunch.
Yeah. Okay, is there anything else you want to add about the Ukraine front lines or any military
okay, well, maybe
analysis?
I'll just say very quickly, there have been these counterattacks over the last couple of weeks in the Zaporozhye region and also along the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporozhye line. And there's a great deal of controversy about, whether or not they've amounted to anything. And the best I can tell, just relying on people that I found to be reliable in the past, mappers, people who look very closely at this, people like Scott of Calibrated or Simplicius, the thinker, or, is that the success has been very, very limited. They've taken back a little bit. It's not even clear that they've taken back Russian-controlled territory. It's more like there was some territory that was in the gray zone that is now Ukrainian occupied or controlled. But we're talking about really very small slivers of territory. And the other part of it is with these counterattacks, this is always true. The Ukrainians take very, very heavy casualties, and the Ukrainians themselves are admitting this. This is something this is nothing new. of course, the Ukrainians have been doing this from pretty much day one of the war. And it's actually, what is notable is how over time these counterattacks have become increasingly weak and ineffective. Again, you go back to 2023 and the famous summer offensive, that actually did take some territory. They never actually got through even the first of the Solovekan lines, but they actually did manage to take some territory. It's more than a piddling amount. It's a significant amount. But of course, eventually the Russians took it all back, and then there was the Kursk offensive, but as time goes on, it's just like they keep on doing this. Every couple of months there will be counterattacks, but what they're able to achieve each time seems to be less than what was happened before, and it shows I think it just reveals the growing weakness of the Ukrainian army.
You want to do a collapse prediction or no?
No. But I'll say that there was. It's the Institute for the Study of War actually predicted a major Russian offensive in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions starting as early as April, is what they said.
I've heard that as well.
I don't know what to make of that, but because, I hear these every year. And
I think Mark Sloboda said something about that as well.
Yeah, it may be true. The thing is, like, I think we may not, like the age of big offensives, big aero offensives may be over in this kind of war anyway, because again, it's just not possible to mass your forces in a way that it once was possible. Has happened again and again in World War II. Like the Soviets would mass, a huge amount of force in one direction and just smash through the German lines, and they did that again and again. Well, you just can't do that now. You mass the forces, and then they. The drones come in and there's carnage. Maybe there's some way they'll figure out a way to do it, but so far it has not been possible. But, it's certainly possible that they just may allocate, let's say, a significant increase in resources, assets to those two directions. And so we'll see an acceleration. Those are places, especially the Zaporozhye. Things have slowed down somewhat since the counterattacks, but it must be pointed out that even if the Ukrainians actually took a little bit of territory, at the same time the Russians continued to move forward in other parts of that same front, in Zaporozhye, they still have managed to move forward, and they've seized more territory. So they, even with these counterattacks, they've failed to really slow down, or maybe they slowed down the Russian advance, but they only managed to slow it down. The advance continues. But perhaps beginning in April or sometime later, there will be a real acceleration. Maybe the Russians will go for a big push, and, not by massing forces, but just by feeding in, more personnel and equipment and just putting even greater pressure on those particular parts of the front.
Okay. Well, let's end with this. So we had a viewer ask if you knew anything about what's going on in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I'm very woefully ignorant of these regions.
Yeah,
so.
I don't know a whole lot about what's going on there, but I do. Yeah, there was let's say, I think an event of some importance. It was that J.D. Vance actually paid a visit to both of those countries about a week ago, and he was given a very warm welcome in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And he talked about the growing ties between them. And he also went on at length about TRIP. That's the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, which is essentially a corridor that is being more or less leased to the U.S. And it's along the southern border of Armenia, where Armenia actually borders Iran. And it would provide, it would be mainly a transportation corridor, at least this is what they're saying, between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And that seems to be going forward. That was something that was agreed to, back in the fall, when Trump announced this peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And my understanding is that, essentially as Armenia gave up a lot and Azerbaijan gave up little or nothing. That's the sad truth of it. Under Pashinyan, the new, very pro-Western Armenian leader, Armenia is, now tilting very strongly towards the West. So now we, in fact, have reports. I don't know if they're true or not, but that among the military assets that are being sent in the direction of Iran, some of them are going to Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so if this attack is launched on Tehran, some of it may actually come out of those two countries. Now, you have to say, okay, now Azerbaijan, I think, has long had a difficult relationship with Russia. It used to be part of the Soviet Union, but it's had a difficult relationship going back for years. Now, Armenia was actually pretty friendly with Russia until recently, really the election of Pashinyan. And this has caused a great deal of distress, actually, within Russia. There was probably Russia's best-known journalist, or the best-known news host, I think I'm probably pronouncing his name incorrectly, but it's like Solyovov or something like that. He said that, we should stop. Look, the Americans have come in, they're playing their usual games. They're taking Armenia from us, and we should actually play like the Americans, like what the Americans did in Venezuela. He said, it's just you use brute force and bring them back. Now, not long after he made that statement, Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry in Russia, said, no, we have friendly relations with Armenia. This is not what Russia does. So, she flatly contradicted or, opposed what he had suggested. But it shows, that America actually continues to succeed in prying away countries that have, actually a very strong connections to Russia. And that's certainly true of Armenia. Armenia is, there are many, many Armenians that live in Russia. Many, many, there's a huge diaspora in Russia. And so their connections to Russia are very strong. And by and large, the population, my understanding, is really very favorably inclined to Russia. But with Pashinyan, his election, you have a government that is tilting away from Russia and to the West, and is not afraid to use, very, let's say, undemocratic means. Like, I think they jailed the bishop, maybe it was a metropolitan, a patriarch, a very high-level bishop. I don't know exactly what his title was. And, pro-Russian businessman, he's really cracked down on any kind of pro-Russian dissent, in a way that's very, very familiar. So there is a great deal of distress, within Russia about it, and within Armenia, to be honest. It just doesn't look very good. It looks like America is succeeding in pulling Armenia away from Russia. Now, that looks, it's not over, though, because I think that, for example, if you could look at Georgia, we had a similar situation several years ago, and it looked like that Georgia was headed in the same direction. And now, with the new election, with what is the name? The something Dream Party. I forget it.
Georgia
right now.
Dream.
Georgia Dream. Right. Yeah. And with Georgia Dream in charge, they have firmly realigned themselves and adopted a firm neutral stance, and they're holding the West at arm's length and playing hardball with them. They're not caving in spite of all the various pressure tactics that the West has used against them. So maybe we'll see the same thing happen in Armenia. And something similar is happening in Moldova. Again, you have a large population. I think it's fair to say the majority is actually very favorably inclined to Russia, but the West and, the elites within Moldova are not at all hesitant to use, any means at their disposal, including very undemocratic, very harsh, very authoritarian means, to pry that country away from Russia and orient it towards the West. So, this is going on, even though I am confident that the future is with multipolarity, that it's rising, that, the unipolar, the Western-led hegemony, or maybe you want to say U.S.-led Western hegemony is on the decline. They still win their battles, even if they're going to win the war and lose the war, I should say.
Okay. Yeah, it's complicated. All these countries, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, most people, I mean, including myself, know very, very little. So it's nice having you be able to break it down for us and explain.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about them, but, that apparently is what's going on.
Well, more than me. Okay. All right, Dad, I think we can end it there.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, very good.
All right. Bye-bye.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.